everyone, and welcome to Dissonant Dialogues. I'm Emily, guest star Casper, and I'm also, you know how about it, and I'm also Claire. Claire, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing pretty good. I feel like our episode today has been a little bit cursed because we've tried filming a couple times,
Three
and
times.
three
Yeah.
times okay, yeah,
Yeah.
things have like popped up and just chaos. So, but it's
Yeah.
an important topic today that we're going
Yeah.
to be discussing.
Yes. Well, you just started your spring break, so hopefully relaxing a little bit more, taking things a little bit easier to talk about some really kind of intense cultural stuff.
That's true. Yeah. And I guess even talking about conservatory culture, we can talk about how breaks are not actually breaks.
So this week we're going to talk about conservatory culture, what it's like. Obviously, there's quite a bit of overlap with conservatory and just a music program out of college. So you might be able to find common ground there if you didn't go to specifically a conservatory. But since that was our background for both of us, that's kind of where we're focusing, what the dynamic is like between other students, between teachers and students. Definitely some overlap with things that we've talked about before, but really kind of delving in more deeply. And then we have some really interesting stories from other people who have written in about their own experiences.
Yeah, this is definitely a hot tea episode. I've brought my
Yeah.
tea to express how crazy this is going to be because, it's about conservatory culture. So it's not that we are strictly saying we can only talk about the bad experiences or only talk about the good experiences. No, it's a mix. It's what's
Yeah.
um, mostly, I guess, not talked about or what's important to talk about. And unfortunately, a lot of those things are the toxicity of music school. So
It's
I
true.
think this is a very important episode because everybody is afraid to talk about experiences like this. A lot of the stories that are coming in are anonymous. Some
Mm-hmm.
of our own, we are getting to a safe place where we can talk about them now.
Yeah.
But sometimes when you're in that program, you're not safe to be able to speak about certain things that happen
No.
to you, and you have to wait till years after to where you're safe. So I think that's a very important thing is that these, seemingly vulnerable or weak college students eventually turn into strong people and they will understand what was done. If you're thinking about going to music school and you're worried about the culture, you don't know what it's like, that's what this episode is for.
The amount of years that I've been out of school is really making this like feel like the right time to talk about it, because I'm like, what are they going to do? Take my degree off my wall? But it took a while. My attitude while I was in school was very much keep your head down, like don't make waves, like be likable, be professional, get in and get out, and then make a difference later. And I think it took some distance, not only to feel comfortable speaking up about things, but for me to realize some of the toxicity and the patterns. Like sometimes you have to zoom out a little bit to even realize what was wrong to begin with. And so many of the conversations I've had with you telling these stories has made me realize and connect the dots of like, wait a second, that was not normal. But it feels very normal when that is your day-to-day life, 5 days a week from 8 a.m. until 7 p.m. And like
Yeah, the
it's
longer you're exposed to something, it's just true.
yeah.
So you do whatever you can to justify this just must be how it is. So this is
Oh,
normal.
for sure.
People accept it, nobody talks about it. So you deal with it. And
Mhm.
oh God, we have to stop accepting that culture. We gotta that's what the point of this episode is to bring awareness.
Yes.
But it's
Yeah.
so dark, but it's so true. That's just naturally what you do is you accept what it is. And you don't have to accept what it is. Things can change.
No,
One of my close friends used to tell me the system is constructed, it can be deconstructed.
that's
And
very true.
like mind blowing to me. I'm like, oh yeah, I don't just have to take what happens. Like I don't have to just like deal with it. No, like things can be changed.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
I think that was my mentality for a long time, was play by all the rules, pay your dues, and then once you get into a position of power, then you can make changes. And the further away that I've gotten from my degree experience, the more I've realized that if I'm going to burn a bridge by telling the truth, that bridge was worth burning. And that's scary. Like I say that now, like it's something easy. It still like gives me a lot of like trepidation, and I still feel very nervous about pissing off the wrong people. Um, we both talked about being seen as a whistleblower, but I can't watch more generations of younger students get hurt in the same ways that you've been hurt, the same ways that I've had friends be hurt. And I just realized like at a certain point, you can't take the power back unless you actually do it. And there is no right time for that. Like the right time is now, which is not to judge anyone who wants to play it safe, who hasn't built up the confidence to do that yet. Just in my own personal journey, realizing the changes, we can't afford to wait until we're all in our 50s and have power and influence, assuming that we even can get that far in our careers. We may have to develop our own performance opportunities, our own companies, start demanding what we deserve, even while the powers that be are angry about that, because they will be angry about it.
That's very true. Yeah. And I think that we should also add, I'm not sure if I would call it a disclaimer, but the reason why we're doing this episode in particular is not to scare people away from going to music.
No.
It's to bring attention to the realities that can happen and that have happened. So some of the stuff I talk about are from a variety of different music schools that we won't name. Some of the stuff doesn't happen maybe at every single music school.
I think most.
Yeah,
I think there's a lot of overlap, but because the industry normalizes this, so the schools will too.
Yeah, that's very true. But yeah, it's just really to bring awareness to the stuff that maybe I wish that I knew before I entered music school, because
For
personally,
sure.
I entered being like, I made it. I made it to conservatory. Now everything's going to be like, I knew I'd have to work hard, but I didn't expect what had happened to me in music school from so many different directions. And I think that that's something you need to at least be aware of, that this can
For
happen.
sure.
Hard, like prepared. My first story is a good one to talk about, because the irony of the story is that I did speak up about something that happened and then I got kicked out of my studio. I'm speaking up about it again because I'm getting to a safer place where I can and don't have to worry about repercussions like that. But I'm also speaking up about just more of the aftermath of it and more of the stuff, because when I spoke up about it, I was not intentionally trying to get anybody in trouble. I was asking for help. And it turned on me the other way. So now I can really speak the whole story of what happened. And apparently always the beginning of my story is very common in music school. So I had a violin lesson with my teacher the night before I was supposed to give a recital on the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto. And this was my very first time playing an entire concerto. And it was my very first time playing a solo on our college concert stage. Like I had only been up there with a quintet before. Otherwise, that was my very first time. So this was a pretty big deal for me. And I was a sophomore at the time. And I felt like a freshman because of the pandemic taking away my freshman year. So it was my first time in person on campus that semester. And that lesson I had the night before my recital. Less than 24 hours before this recital, my teacher, she yelled the entire lesson. And then eventually she stopped yelling. And it was just more of a disappointed talking, saying, I think you need to quit violin. Maybe violin just isn't for you if you can't do this right. I think you need to cancel the concert. Can you call somebody to cancel the concert maybe? And just multiple things like that, saying it wasn't natural to me. I couldn't correct my intonation fast enough. So violin, I just shouldn't do it. I should quit. And it was as simple as that. I'm not changing the words. Those were the exact words that were said to me. And at the time it was still, I had to like protect more so from my teachers, but I think actually we were also required still to wear our masks. So I did have a mask on in the lesson. I knew that my teacher sitting 2 feet in front of me could see just tears soaking my mask. And I wasn't sobbing. The tears were just falling and I just kept playing. She's like, no, out of tune. Oh, you need to just quit. And I just keep playing and keep trying the entire hour. And afterwards, I guess the ironic thing is that my mom had just been diagnosed with cancer at the time, and it was my first time away from her too at college, and just so much was going on. And she said to me, "Oh, well, I'm sorry to be so mean to you at your lessons today. I know you have a lot going on with your mom." And I was like, "It's okay." And I was just trying to get my stuff and get out because I was like, "Oh my God, like oh my God, like what do I do?" Call somebody and figure out what to do. And I didn't really have many people to like call or reach out to. I reached out to the first person I could think of, which couldn't really like help at the time. And I was like, what am I supposed to do? And I reached out over Instagram because I have a large following of tons of musicians. And I was like, okay, what do I do? And I did not name my teacher. I didn't name anything specific. I think I just said something like a teacher, or this was said to me. It was something like that. And I don't know what to do. I have to perform. I can't cancel the concert. The concert really wasn't for me. I got chosen to do it for the pianist that was taking a collaborative pianist class, learning to accompany other students. And so it was not really my concert, although it also was. It was for her. I couldn't cancel. And I kind of explained that online and I got tons of responses, such supportive advice, and this is what you need to do. This is how you need to like process this. You need to try to block this out. You need to try to do this with this, and like kind of explaining to me. And like it really helped. And I was like, okay, I'm good. I can do it. I gave the recital. It was fabulous. I think I did good. Maybe I wasn't perfectly in tune, but hey, I was a sophomore. I started violin when I was 12 and I was playing the Mendelssohn Concerto. Like that's a huge
It's
deal.
never as bad as they make you believe.
Yeah. Yeah. Cause when I listened back to it, I was like, geez, I mean, like, yeah, I wasn't really that in tune, but it wasn't that bad. Like I shouldn't quit because of it. Like,
Yeah.
um, the story goes on. And this is, I guess, something that I haven't spoken about because it was months later that all of a sudden I have two teachers. So I went to a lesson with the other teacher and she just had this very kind of like dark kind of look on her face. And she told me to sit down. And I was like, oh, okay. And I had my violin and music and stuff out. And she just said, no, sit down. And she told me that my other teacher had kicked me out of her studio and that we need to figure out what I was going to do because now I only had one teacher, but that other teacher had me like part-time. So my other teacher was like, okay, do you want me full-time? Do you want to have me and another teacher? And I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. I'm kicked out of the studio? Like this was my dream studio to be in. I came here to my dream school and my dream city with my dream teacher that like I worked really well with. Like, what are you talking about? What happened? And apparently there were students at my school in the violin studio, that's as far as they would tell me because of confidentiality, they're not allowed to tell me, that screenshotted my post and they shared it with her and other faculty members and said I was trying to like ruin her reputation and ruin the name of the school. Right away my teacher's like, okay, well, she's that unhappy, yeah, we're just gonna take her out of the studio. And that was just it. And yeah, I
But
broke
it took months before that happened.
it. Took months. Yeah.
That's
So
interesting.
that's how I know it was vindictive because it took them that long. And I guess something, they must have not liked something about me. Maybe I got an opportunity that they were mad about. I haven't really analyzed that whole thing, but something got some of those students jealous or upset with me. I don't know. And then that's must have been why they went right to them.
Interesting.
Yeah, I was told it was multiple students from school, and then it was one of like a random Instagram follower too that like sent an email to my teacher that didn't even know my teacher. And it was months
Interesting.
later. All of that was months later. It did not happen right away. It was months later. So I'm like, okay, whoa. And so right away then, it just so happened that my teacher that this whole thing happened with, when I went to call her and like explain and also apologize, because I also didn't realize that people were that obsessed with me that they were going to piece those things together and then share it and like make it about her reputation when I was asking for help. So I tried to explain that to her, and I didn't even really have to explain much because it just so happened that she was getting a surgery done and she was taking pain medication. Like I swear that was like the day after her surgery. Like she was still like, it was a big surgery and everything. And so she was like not in the right place. And so she was just like, oh, okay, yeah, like, oh, that was months ago. Oh, then you're fine. And I'm like, oh, okay.
Okay.
All right. And I was just, I'll take it. I'll take it. Okay. And from that point on, I could never fully trust everybody in my studio. I had a best friend
Yeah.
at school who played violin, and I knew it wasn't her. And I'm like, okay, well, she's fine. But it was everybody else. I felt like I could not make friends because I didn't know who it was. I had suspicions,
Hmm.
couldn't say for certain of like who it was
Yeah.
in the studio. So that was hard because it was really hard to make friends then with other violinists when I knew that there were people that were out to get me in that way. And by another faculty member, I was kind of being told to keep my distance from certain students as well, just to be safe was their reasoning, but it turned out to be for a different reason. And yeah, so it was a lot. And I feel like my perspective on that, I'm always trying to find the positive. Like I always try to justify everything and be like, what can I take from it? Like bad things just keep happening to me in my life. So what's the good? What's the good? And I told myself, like, well, this is a good lesson for me. And it's a good story for me to share with my students someday. I have the experience of having one of those really rough teachers that tells you you're horrible and to quit, like people talk about. But then I also have the more modern day kind of teaching style as well. So I've experienced both. That's good. And I can share that story with my students. But then I was like, well, wait, was it worth the damage that did?
Mm.
Because I'm not going to lie, it took me probably about a year to overcome that. I didn't really want to practice. I felt down, and not that I didn't want to practice, I just felt so down when I was practicing.
Hmm.
And so I was still like working hard, but I was like, oh God, I'm never going to be good enough. I'm never going to be good enough. It was never, I want to work at this. I want to work at this. It was like, it's still not right. It's still not right. And that
Yeah.
was more frustration added. And then also, was it worth the damage of not being able to make friends in my violin studio out of fear? it's important to talk about because I had also gotten a lot of Instagram responses where people said, "Oh my gosh, the same thing happened to me. My teacher
Yeah.
it." And it's like we're so afraid to talk about it because we could get kicked out of the studio, like I
Yeah.
did. Um, but it's also important to talk about because
Hmm.
I don't think our teachers are intentionally trying to damage us by saying that. And the ironic thing too is that months later, maybe like, well, maybe it was about a year, almost a full year later, my teacher apologized. It was so out of the blue, and she was just like, I've really changed my teaching style, and I'm sorry that I did that, and I'm not like that anymore. I'm not going to teach that way because I don't think it does any good. And I was like, happy. I'm like, okay, well, she learned like from that. At least there's something out of that. She won't do that to anybody else anymore. Good. But then I'm like, well, at least it saved other people in the future, but it didn't save me. What about
Yeah.
me?
Yeah. Yeah. I think you've touched on a couple themes that are going to come up over and over again. The first being, was it worth it? And the two being, what about me? Like those are, because those are things that I asked myself a lot. I think you had a really common experience. What baffles me about that attitude is that we're not professionals who have been hired. We're students who pay an arm and a leg to be there and get accepted by teachers who promise to teach us. So to me, if a professor is being that critical of your musical ability after accepting you, the only person who deserves that criticism, particularly in your first couple of years, is them. I think that is what's fascinating to me is there would be so many things where I would get the same critique over and over and over again. And I would keep coming to them and being like, I'm not lazy about this. I'm not trying. So why can't you all help me? Like if we're spending, hundreds of thousands of dollars to just be in the room,
Mhm.
like, I think it would be so much easier to swallow, not that it was ever okay, but swallow harsher criticism if we were getting free education. But the
Yeah.
fact that like we're in a sense, and I know a lot of people think it sounds very entitled to say that, but in a sense, we're paying customers for our education. So if you're my teacher and you're unimpressed with my ability, that to me falls on you, because who has reached their full potential at 18, 19, 20, 21? Like who is there yet? That kind of anger and frustration, I think, makes a lot more sense. Not that it's okay to talk to somebody like that, but when you've hired somebody and they are not up to your standard. But if you're their teacher, then I don't understand what that accomplishes. And I think a lot of it is like generational teacher trauma. I think a lot of them were spoken to that way. And there has become this like normalization of like, well, this is how you pay your dues. I went through it, so you should too. And I think a lot of them think, well, I went through that and I turned out okay. I think we all oftentimes know that when people say that, like I think of like, boomer generation parents who are like, oh, my parents hit me and I'm fine. And sometimes you're like, well, are you though? Like, I'm not sure you can see what I'm seeing here, like it's one of those things. And again, generational issues, cultural issues. I can definitely relate to, obviously not with my studio teacher. And it's hard to tell these stories because these are people that from a professional standpoint, I really respect and admire and I think are extremely qualified, but that I struggled with emotionally. The thing that frustrated me the most was this idea of like, we should tell you something once. So if you're sitting in a lesson and you are corrected in something that you're doing that has become muscle memory, and then they say, okay, do it this way, and then you run the whole phrase again and you make the mistake again the second or the third time, and they say, oh, we just fixed that, why are you still making that mistake? And it's like, yeah, you fixed it 5 minutes ago and I have a couple weeks of muscle memory to go and undo. Something else I was told a lot was, you already know this, why are you making that mistake? That mentality was the like told to me over and over again. Or I would say, I'm struggling with this, and somebody would say, well, why are you struggling? And I would give them an answer and they would say, that's not a reason. That's something I heard from multiple people multiple times. Literally just, that's not a reason. You know how to do X, Y, and Z, so therefore that's not a reason. And I was like, okay, I guess I just hallucinated the problem. Sorry, I completely made it up. You cured me. I'm fixed. Everything's good now. And it's one of those things that like it took me a long time to get over that. Having professors who would kick you out of the classroom if they got angry at you. That was a common occurrence that everyone I knew has been through at least once. You know, and then having those same people later asking you, well, what do you like about yourself? What are you good at? What are your strengths? And sitting there going, I have no idea, because all I can think about is how much I hate myself. So crying in, you know, all kinds of lessons and coachings and, you know, and rehearsals was very normal. I did it a lot. Getting sick beforehand, getting sick after, like that was very common. And it took, I won't even say it took a long time, because it's still taking a long time to get those voices out of my own head when it comes to, you know, the things that I've been told, but particularly the, you shouldn't struggle with this, you shouldn't have this problem because X, Y, and Z was really, really hard for me, because it made me afraid of giving the wrong answer. It made me afraid to, when people would ask like what I needed, or when somebody would ask, why are you struggling with this? I would not be thinking of what was true. I'd be thinking of what they would want me to tell them.
Mhm.
And so there was a breakdown of trust, like this, you know, this discomfort that came from trying to anticipate what my professors wanted me to say, because sometimes when I was honest, then I would hear, well, that's not a good reason. And then eventually they would catch on. And this was multiple professors would catch on and say like, you know, no, what do you actually think? And I can't tell you. I can't tell you. How could I tell you? Like, no matter how I try to explain it, I can't. And as somebody who has been diagnosed with PTSD and has a lot of trauma within my own body, a lot of trouble living in my body, it was always very hard for me to describe how things felt. So, you know, I would get upset and be like asked why is this so upsetting? Or what did this feel like? And so being told that I was doing something wrong, being told like, describe what this feels like. And I would describe something and they'd say, that's not a feeling. And I'd be like, okay. You know, like I think sometimes professors don't realize that when they don't get the response they want from their students, it is sometimes a trauma reaction that keeps them limited in the way that they are. I realize that some of my diction issues come from the fact that I have been dissociated for most of my life. I have trouble inhabiting my body physically. So anything that involves a lot of physical labor, dance, movement, choreography, and to an extent, like the micro expressions that go into pronouncing and learning foreign languages, it becomes really, really difficult for me to internalize what those movements feel like, because I'm not in my body. And that's taken years of therapy to even just begin to float back down into it. And I just wish there was more recognition for the fact that if a student continues to struggle with the same things over and over again, it's not because they're deficient, it's because they've never been taught. And whose job is that?
That's an interesting thing where I love the perspective that I can have because for the majority of my time in conservatory, I was the middleman. I was a student, but I was also a teacher. So I was
Right.
seeing the way that I was being taught, and then I was seeing the way that I would teach my students. And some of the things I'm like, God, I could never say that to one of my students. What's the point? Like what's going to come out of that? I think that some teachers struggle to accept that there are ways to help somebody get better without the brutal criticism that they feel like they need to throw in there. And I know people could try to say, oh, well, that made you more resilient. The fact that you were told to quit, it made you work harder. It didn't.
At what cost, though?
It added a hurdle for me to have to get over. Yeah, I was working harder to get over that hurdle. And then I could pick up from where I left off. That's where the harder work comes in. It
Yeah.
doesn't actually make you better.
No, you're
And
working harder and not smarter. It's wasting your time, it's wasting your emotional energy and your resources.
exactly. Yeah. And kind of like what you're bringing up, there was a story. This wasn't sent in, but I had just heard the story from somebody before of somebody that went to Juilliard and they went to their, like, it was like a 7 a.m. lesson, 7 or 8 a.m. lesson. And they had to travel like very far for it. And they went there and the teacher told them, you're literally wasting my life right now because they didn't practice enough or didn't appear to practice enough. And it's kind of like that idea that they were instilling that you have to always be overworking yourself to be worth your teacher's time. And even if you do overwork yourself, you might still not be worth your teacher's time. And you're also paying that teacher for their time. Like,
Yeah. I
yeah,
don't think anyone within the year, like at 18, 19, 20, like I don't think anyone's future is decided enough for a teacher to be able to make a statement about their entire career. I think you are made of so much potential at that age and at the beginning, honestly, your entire undergrad, that making these sort of depressing prophecies over your students at that age, all you're likely to do is burn them out. It doesn't help. And it is odd that there is almost, and we've brought this up before, a pride in the dropout rate, a pride in telling people, oh, not everybody can make it. And the fact that, I had a professor who very recently does not work there anymore, who started his class by saying, this is the class where we weed out the weak. That was his exact phrase. And I remember, because I took that class twice, both times, first day of class, syllabus day. That was how it started. And just being kind of shocked at how like funny that was to the professors. Like it was like something they were proud of. That really deeply bothered me, because I was like, in what other industry is there where a professor can have a 50% fail rate in their class and say, look how good we are for that, and not get fired or, reprimanded, retrained, something? Like, what other industry is there like that?
Yeah, and those professors that handled like that class in particular, I remember were very like, no, we don't change the curriculum. It is designed this. I have heard like many, sometimes they were talking to me about the way that they designed their curriculum, and they had told me that they did not want to do any more work. They just wanted to leave it the way it was. Although they would still complain that students weren't doing well, or they must just not be trying hard enough. But then they make comments like that. And that just kind of shows everything. It's not the students. And there was a particular thing with a different professor, but same class, very difficult class that I was taking, and I was really struggling with the material. And I tried meeting with other professors before I met with this one particular professor, because that particular professor scared me so bad. I feel like we talked about this before, but it was a professor that would point in my face and yell at me.
Previously on Dissonant Dialogues.
Redacted.
Like I had no choice. I tried going to other teachers, but it's like ultimately he teaches the class, so let me just try. And so we met on Zoom one-on-one. And the very first thing that he said to me on the Zoom was, can you suck any more time out of my life? And
Jesus.
I never told you that, I don't think. But
no,
I awkwardly laughed because I was so, and I really didn't ask him for help much because I was so scared of him. I would go to the TA. I would go to another professor that taught the course before. I would go to people in the class, and then people in the class couldn't explain it to me either. And I was like, well, okay. And then I finally went to him, and that's what I got. And I just awkwardly laughed and listened to him just say that stuff, and then try to explain it to me and be like, you need to work harder. You need to practice this more. And I'm just like,
is that the best you can do? Like, if that's your advice, is just work harder, and it's not working, because I guarantee you none of us are not working hard. We're pulling our hair out. We are literally dying to try and make people proud of us. At a certain point, you have to teach differently to kind of work into the teacher attitudes in the classroom. I wanted to talk about disability accommodations. I was told that disability accommodations were optional. Now, the more people I've spoken to, the more they've said, well, that's not true. Legally, you are required to have these sorts of accommodations. So what people might not understand is there is a difference between a music program, like being a music major at a school, and conservatory. And so I was told that because we were a conservatory and not just a music program, that there was flexibility in what disabilities they had to accommodate. And I guess to some extent that makes sense. If somebody has their hands amputated and says they want to be a piano major, and then claims discrimination because they are not allowed to be in the program, I guess you do have to make allowances for that sort of thing, because that doesn't make sense at a certain point. So I was entitled to, I had a visual processing disorder, and then later, it took me a very long time to get a diagnosis. I didn't get a diagnosis until the summer before my 5th year of school. but from having POTS, which let me have some extra absences because of the chronic fatigue I dealt with. I went to like the disability office and I filled out the paperwork. I provided doctor's notes, everything that I needed to do that. When it came to Roosevelt classes, because we had certain classes that were like Roosevelt versus CCPA, if it was an extracurricular or if it was something that Roosevelt offered. So like my language courses, opera singers required to take French, German, and Italian. But we don't just have like a conservatory class for those. We have diction classes just for those, but we take those with anyone else who wants to just take a language at Roosevelt. So in my classes that were Roosevelt classes, no questions asked. They had to follow the rules. For everyone else, I was told that it was optional. It was at their discretion. So while I had, it was much easier for the academic accommodations, those that included having time and a half on exams, getting to take exams in private. I really didn't have any trouble with that. I did have some people pitch fits about stuff that was considered a quiz grade, because there's a lot of classes where your quiz grade is them pointing at you in class and being like, this is your week to do this dictation in front of everyone, your week to conduct things. And technically, I was entitled to have those alone, and they didn't want to schedule all of that around me. So there were some professors who just wouldn't, and I just didn't fight, even if it crippled my grade. There were some that I did feel more comfortable reminding them, but after a while, it just got exhausting. When it came to the absences thing, a lot of them, when I turned in the paperwork, were like, well, that's not how things work here. And, and I wasn't somebody who like wanted to take advantage of this. I wasn't doing it so I could be hungover in the morning or have fun. It was because I would faint or have paralysis or be in the hospital. And the more that I've looked into it, the more I cannot find legally where their loophole is. But I do think it's interesting that that was normalized. And I knew a lot of students with health problems and disabilities. And I had a conversation after graduation with a professor who I adore and respect so much. But the thing that kind of broke my heart a little bit is talking to her after my health had declined, even more to the point of using mobility aids, and talking about just like how much work I put in, how much I tried to hide it, how much I feel like I was holding myself together with sheer grit and willpower. And just, saying like, yeah, I think the second that I could relax a little bit, my body fell apart. And she was saying these wonderful things that you always want to hear. You always want to hear how proud your professors are of you, saying like, you work so hard and I know I can trust you. You've had dilemmas, but I always know that you're going to put in the extra work to, compensate for them. And I know that I can count on you. Stuff that like made me feel so seen and so comforted, but then followed it up with, most disabled people use it as an excuse. That was her exact words. And that broke me a little bit, because I don't want,
with a disability that has tried to use something as an excuse. Like, where do they get that stuff from? I just don't.
So I know that there were some students who had health problems who the professors were incredibly cruel to. And oftentimes there were a few students who were harder to get along with. But let me tell you something that's really difficult. When you live with chronic pain, it is hard to bend over backwards to be sunshine and rainbows all the time. It is really hard to be completely chipper. And sometimes I question, were these students actually rude, or were they not just like not like bowing over to like please you? Were they not like completely brown nosing? Like, because I think sometimes the people in this industry in a position of power have a hard time knowing the difference between basic polite and absolutely like becoming this like servant to somebody and like ingratiating yourself to them. Not that I'm, again, I don't see every interaction, not that students have never actually been rude. I'm sure people have. I have a lot of empathy for the fact that when you live in a body that is attacking you, it is very, very hard to be like, to never snap at anybody, to never panic, to never, come across as rude because you're in pain. I worked very hard to do that. but it took a lot of emotional energy, and other aspects of my life, my energy, my social life, my mental health failed as a result of how much effort I had to put in, not just to getting the requirements done, but also to posturing myself in the correct way. It really sucked to be praised for something at the expense of a group that is prejudiced against, that I am a part of. I don't want to be told that I'm one of the good ones. I want this pathway to be accessible to people who have physical and mental challenges. But instead, and that's where it like really kind of split me in half a little bit, because it felt so good to get that recognition. And then it came at that price. I was like, really? That's what we think here? It broke my heart.
Yeah. In that moment, do you remember, did you do the awkward laugh and try to get yourself out of there and then process it later and be like, oh my God, or did it hit you in the moment?
You know what? I'm really proud of myself. If I had still been in school, I absolutely would have just like awkward laughed it. But because this was a conversation that happened after I graduated, I challenged that. And I said, I really disagree with that. And I mentioned that I think some of the ugliness was a defense mechanism. And I kind of got steamrolled over in that conversation. Like it kind of got like dismissed, and then an elevator came and we were saying goodbye and everything. And so, the conversation sort of fizzled out, but I did try to at least say, put up, like make it known that I don't on principle agree with this. But was I terrified? Yeah, I felt like I was going to pass out saying that. I'm sure I must have seemed very casual, but that was nerve-wracking. And that was the first time I'd ever done that. And I even mentioned like, hey, I mentioned a specific student and I said, like, I don't like the way that I saw the student being treated. And the response to that was, well, you don't know everything. You don't know how bad it was. And I was like, no, I know, because you all saw the student struggling and then said, Claire, go save the student, go be their friend, go fix everything. And so like, I was like, I know, I understand what you're talking about. I do not think in any world that this treatment was appropriate. And this wasn't just this professor, this was a cultural thing. People were comfortable calling it wasn't just one, like there were students, when teachers didn't like the students, they would call them bitches. They would badmouth them behind closed doors in front of other students. It bothered me a lot. I also think that there is an element of classism that comes into not liking certain students' attitudes. I think there is a dynamic that exists in a lot of families that I have met, where the attitude is much like the world is there to get you. Everybody wants to screw you over. Don't take shit from anyone. And so you need to strike first. You need to treat everybody like they're trying to scam you. And that has kind of been learned as a survival technique, particularly in families of certain backgrounds. The ability to be at ease in conversations with people, to expect good things from other people, expect to be treated well, that is a symptom of privilege. That is something that takes a certain amount of comfort in your upbringing in order to internalize. I was taught to network. I was not taught to defend myself. I was told to network. And that, to me, was an aspect of privilege in my upbringing. But you can't expect a student who didn't have that exact same background to come in as an 18, 19-year-old and know how to do that. That's something that has to be taught. And that teaching has to come from trust. You need to make your student feel safe enough to even be able to want to network rather than to defend themselves. And if you throw them into a hyper competitive environment with very antagonistic professionals and then say, oh, just let us step on you, just sit there and take it, when they've been taught, don't take it because everyone's trying to take advantage of you. And the professor's mentality or the professional's mentality is, this is how I condition you for this career. That's problematic to me. Of course, that's going to cause a defense mechanism. In most people, their instinct, as it probably should be, will be to say, I shouldn't take this. I have to stand up for myself. But then they can't, because then the professors are like, well, that was a test. if you stand up for yourself, you failed the test.
Yeah, there's that whole make connections, not friends mentality. Huge
Mm-hmm.
thing. And not only in music school, I had talked to somebody that's in like kind of like a journalism and like broadcasting sort of interest. And they said the same exact thing where they were like, I don't know that I even want to do this profession. I'm about to graduate. I don't know that I want to do it because we're only taught to make connections, not friends. That's a lonely field.
It
And I think
is.
it's a huge thing. It's something that my teachers, like older teachers that are in like their 50s, 60s, 70s, thinking about the stories they told me. Oh yeah, after concerts, we used to go out and like get a drink together or go out for dinner together. And I'm like, for real? And that's what I was expecting going to conservatory. It's like, does that happen now? I mean, I don't know about you, but for me, no one did that. Maybe there were like a couple, I think there was like one like little group in my school that I had heard about that occasionally did that, but generally, no, that was not a
Yeah.
thing. After concerts, you go back to the practice room and practice, or you go back to your room and do homework or whatever. But no one ever hung out or anything. It was like you do what you need to do to make connections and talk with people like just enough to get them to like you and want you for gigs. But to also be wanted for gigs, you have to constantly be practicing, and they want your abilities to be that much higher. And I think that's something that really broke my heart about conservatory culture was I was expecting literally the same like things I was like telling myself. And I think I told my high school directors, I'm like, I'm so excited to go to conservatory and to make a bunch of friends that are like me, that they like music like me.
Yeah.
My high school, nobody liked music like me. And like I can finally make real friends that like this. And I'm gonna find a music nerd and we're gonna get together and we're gonna get married and we're gonna have like little music babies. And that's just it. That's what's gonna happen. And like that's what I expected entirely. And I learned the dark reality about that. And it's just not true. And yeah, just to kind of throw into with what you were saying about teachers talking badly about students in front of other students, that has happened, like professors talking badly about other students, and particularly like one-on-one conversations. Three
Yeah.
students with three different types of disabilities, and the professor had made fun of all three for different reasons, trying to get me to not be friends with particular ones, or just like making fun of them because they were a distraction to them in some way. And so it was also hard seeing professors that I really respected talk badly about students like that. And I was like, geez, like does that mean like if I need an accommodation or something with me that they're going to think I'm a pain? If I have questions, if I need extra help, they're going to think of me that way too. I don't want people I really respect to think of me that way. And then it also has me nervous, like, oh, well, now like they were talked badly about, so I can't really be friends with these students. And I'm seeing this professor say this about students, and now I just don't feel like safe anywhere. It's like nowhere safe.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting point and this is a lesson that I hope the pandemic has taught some people. No one is guaranteed health. If you live long enough, you will become disabled in some way at some point in your life, whether it's becoming hard of hearing or losing your vision or having trouble walking when you get older. Like being able-bodied is a temporary state of life and a privilege, and you're not guaranteed it. You can become disabled at any point in your life. You can do everything right. You can exercise and eat well and take care of yourself, and you can still have something happen. We're seeing it now with a lot of people who have long COVID. A lot of the people who have long COVID issues like were young, healthy people who oftentimes even had relatively minor cases of COVID and then just never recovered in a weird way. We don't understand it. And so it really did disturb me to see professors act as though disability was this very foreign, very rare thing, when I'm like, well, how would you respond if and when it happens to you? And then imagine that happening while you're still trying to have a professional career. Imagine that. Like it really was difficult to watch that kind of treatment and to realize like, the disability population and people who have academic needs and things, it's very common. It's probably more people than not who need some kind at some stage in their life of assistance, of accommodation. It didn't surprise me that there were systemic blocks to making sure these spaces are inclusive. What did surprise me was how comfortable faculty were with expressing their disdain for these marginalized groups of people.
Yeah, I feel like right now too, we're kind of on the topic about abuse in conservatory, specifically by people that are in positions of power.
Yeah.
And this is not a very light topic, and I'm just kind of going to brush gently over it for now. But I think something that is probably, I would say, is one of the darkest things in the classical music world and in conservatory is people protecting abusers within classical music. So people kind of have this perspective, like musicians in particular, that are like, okay, we don't tolerate abuse from non-musicians. That is wrong. Like this is bad. We don't know. But if they're musicians, we got to cover for them because we got to save our name. We either got to save the name of the school or save the name of the industry or save the name of like blah, 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 or whatever. If they're a part of it, then you got to cover. I think that's where those like covering stuff comes in. And I wanted to share a message that I had received from somebody. I'm not going to share too much about the background of it because this was very personal from somebody else and I don't want to give any hint as to who it was, but I think it's very important. And I will give the information that this person, they're like 60, 70, maybe 60-ish. So take that into consideration. Somebody that did also go to music school. And they said to me, I admire your courage for speaking out and thank you for sharing this with me. We were talking about something. I'm sorry that this happened to you. I'm surprised and saddened that this continues to happen today, especially with more people speaking out. And I will tell you, it happened to me too in college. She's referring to sexual assault. Only in our times, we capitalized never spoke of it. In fact, we were often blamed for looking too good and asking for it, which of course led to much shame and self-reproach. But you are strong, capable, talented, and brilliant. That's very sweet. And in spite of this, I have every confidence that you can and will rise above this and live a life beyond belief, fulfilling your dreams and purpose. So very sweet. But I reading a message from this person being like, my God, I know this person pretty well. They have made a wonderful life for themselves, a wonderful career, and they were sexually assaulted while in music school. And that was the mentality back then. And this was not the only like adult that's in their like 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever, that like of that age range that had told me, oh, this happened to me in music school too. Oh, actually, I went through this. Like they all have their stories. It's like this stuff happens a lot.
It
Like
does.
happens a lot. And not only by your fellow classmates, but by professors. This is
Yeah.
this happens. This is common, but it's so shunned down because musicians want to protect, not all musicians, of course, but there are a lot of musicians that are in the state where like, no, we need to protect our name. We need to protect this. We don't want to believe that this exists and kind of going into a denial. And that's the result of what happens is that then the victims are blamed.
Mhm.
And I think that this is very important to bring up because for me reading this message, I was like, whoa, it happened to her too. Like, oh my goodness. And she's created a wonderful life for herself, but look at what things were like then, where it's like, you don't talk about it. You don't say anything about it. And now even saying, I've had multiple people say this, it's like, geez, now that people are talking about it, it's still happening. Well, how does that work? And I think we're all kind of questioning this right now for the people that want to bring awareness to it and change. We're asking these questions of like, okay, why is it still happening now that we're speaking out about it? How do we prevent it? And there are ways to prevent it, but a lot of people don't want to do that work. So yeah, that's as much as I'll say about abuse like that in music.
Yeah.
But
And I think you're touching on something important, which is that dialogue is the first step in change. The reason that it's still happening is because it also takes changes to our infrastructure and changes to our systems, and those take much longer to implement. The people who are the most willing to speak out are oftentimes the people who might work in the industry but do not yet have the power. So if the people who are abusers still have the power and all that is happening right now is conversations, they're absolutely not motivated to take steps to make students safer. They benefit from the systems. Maybe they don't benefit from the systems of abuse, but maybe their boss does or something like that. Like, there's somebody that they're afraid to piss off, and everybody sort of has this like, we're out for ourselves mentality. That's really hard. So I think it does feel gut-wrenching to know this is so common. People are speaking out about it. Why is it still happening? People need to retire and die before some of these changes take place. Like, just to be real, it's the same with like our political landscape, and it's the same with systems of abuse in religious communities and things that have been very well known for decades. The talking is the first step, and then you have to organize. That's very hard. That's very scary. And the powers that be have made it difficult for us to organize. Even let's think about like the last few years with the pandemic. There's been a huge loss of community for people. There's a lot of strength in numbers, but if you're in a competitive industry And then you don't even have the bonding experience of being physically close to people. You have just, you've taken all of these blocks to intimacy. Not that they didn't have to happen, obviously they did. The innate insecurities and competitiveness that are natural in this industry, and not even necessarily a bad thing. Like, I think you need to learn what competitiveness feels like and how to navigate when it gets ugly. I think it's an important emotion to wrestle with and can at times be healthy to feel competitive. But then you pair that with a lack of intimacy, a lack of friendship, a lack of community, that antagonism, it's not going to be limited to the scope of where it's supposed to be. It's going to permeate every other aspect of your life. That becomes really, really difficult for people's mental health when it comes to speaking out, because it's easy to put something on social media, but it's really hard to organize and inspire change in your actual communities. That takes real life interaction. And a lot of people, I think, are just afraid of that right now.
Yeah, something really dark too that I came across that, I mean, my situation's a little bit different because I was very isolated for a different reason, into my sophomore year, like my entire junior year. But I felt that there was more community my freshman year, which was all online from my bedroom during the pandemic, than
Yeah.
when I went in person to school. And I think that was the thing, is that I was like dying to go to school. I'm like, I want to make all these friends. And I was already kind of making friends online, but I'm like, no, I want to be with them. I want to do fun
Yeah.
things. Explore the city. I want to live this life. Like that was the point, and I want to do that. And when I got there, it was like, no, everybody is all for themselves. You go to the
Yeah.
practice, that was all there was. The community I thought that should be there wasn't there.
Yeah.
And we were way closer during a pandemic than when.
It does make sense. There's almost like a we're all in this together thing that happened.
Yeah.
And then, but it also, I think, did like collective PTSD to all of our brains. So then sometimes it's harder. I think sometimes it's easier for people to be kind when they're in crisis mode. And then when things sort of relax a little bit, those fears and competitiveness sort of come out of the woodwork, if that makes sense.
I see.
Because you have the energy for it, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. I do think there is a difference, and we've talked about this before, in the instrumentalist culture versus the singer culture. I do think it just, from what I've heard from you, it does seem like the singers were a little bit more of a community. Generally, I felt like a lot of the really hostile competitiveness was kept to like the first year, maybe the first 2 years. And then afterwards, there was sort of a, well, this sucks for all of us, so we might as well like each other. Sort of mentality. But I also think a lot of that comes from the fact that singers are kind of on their own. And I'm curious what your perception of this was, if you have any at all, because like it was hard to be friends with instrumentalists. And they were, I mean, you have different schedules, you have different things, but the mentality, the stereotype is singers are not always treated like musicians. Like oftentimes you'll be in a rehearsal with choir and orchestra, and they'll say like, take a 15-minute break, and then will the singers and the musicians meet us back on stage? And it's like, well, what's the word on my degree? I'm in the same theory classes, I'm doing all the same stuff, and then like I'm learning 3 languages and acting and dancing on top of it. But there is kind of like an innate disrespect, like in terms of like the musical food chain. I do think that like probably near the top is like pianists. They're on another level. They're off by themselves. You never see them. I think violin tends to be the most abused, but in terms of like the collective instrument tends to be the most respected by others. Not the way that individual students are treated, but in terms of like the actual instrument. But like if you go down the food chain, there's singers way down here. And I think that helps us to be a little bit more of a community with each other. But yeah, that is something I was like, do you notice like a food chain placement? Do you notice that certain instruments get treated better than others?
That's a really good question. I mean, there is the obvious one where violinists and cellists are treated better than violists and bassists.
That's true. I know that one.
Yeah, we all notice it with the violists, but not a lot of people talk about how cellists are treated better than bassists, and that's something
That's
that
interesting.
I guess I'm not too familiar with the woodwind and brass land or percussion land of like how that works, but yeah, I'm aware of that stuff in the strings. And yeah, I guess like, we're taught early on that mentality of like first violin's better than second violin. And then it took like growing up to realize like, oh, well, I know that that's not true. I know that the second violin part oftentimes can be harder than the first violin part because you got all the complex rhythms and like underneath the melody, the part that you don't know very well takes longer to learn. But there's still like older people in power that think about it the other way and they're like, no, first violin is better, is more important. And like collectively put what they call weaker people in the second violin section, and the first violin section is like all graduate level students, and then undergrads all in second violin. And it's like, really, we should be getting a mix.
Right.
There is that part for violinists. We are kind of if you're in second violin, people are still treating it that way. That still exists, even though like there's a good number of us that know that that's not true. First violin's not number one better, and second's not like the worst underneath it. No, like we know that that's not true. But still, like some of those stereotypes still exist.
Did you have a perception of singers, or was that just like not even on your radar?
Honestly, it was not on my radar, but my freshman year, I had a friend that was a singer, and she kind of let me in on her feelings to that and what she experienced, because she had a first year in person, and then her second year of her master's was online from the pandemic. Yeah. But everything that you just said, she said the same thing.
Yeah.
To be a collective dynamic that everybody experiences, I guess, as singers. But no, not something that I was aware of at all. I think I was just in my own world. So I think a lot of instrumentalists don't even realize it. It's like that you're not affected by it, you don't notice it, or if you hear about it, oh, can't be important because I'm fine. And it's sort of that mindset. It's like it's something that needs to be like spoken about, and all different types of abuse, basically.
This concludes part 1 of our episode on conservatory culture. But don't worry, part 2 is out now on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.